Howdy, everyone. It's quite appropriate we say howdy again because I have another American guest, not necessarily from the South, but it's howdy nevertheless. But I was told that howdy is a word that is used more often by white people, but I'm gonna play out my ignorant self here and say howdy anyways. Hey, brother. Assalamu alaikum, by the way. His name is Omar.
Walaikum salam. Glad to be on today.
Thanks for doing this. Thank you for
I don't
coming.
use howdy, but I've heard it being used, so you
Right.
know.
As I said, just putting out my ignorance out there. Anyways,
Likewise,
yeah.
likewise.
Omar is a political science student. I'll let him tell more about himself, but it's quite interesting how me and Omar are connecting on this podcast because I have a friend called Samuel Abak, who's a friend of mine from my college days, and he is married to Omar's sister, and he lives in US, and he got me connected with Omar, and I'm glad I'm doing this because I believe I am podcasting with a person who's a lot more smarter and a lot more knowledgeable than I am. I'm a dummy, and I'm here to listen to him.
Yeah, well,
Brother,
shout out to Priya, right, for
uh,
connecting us.
right? Can you tell people what you do? What have you studied exactly?
Yeah. So I'm within the realm of political science, but my field is called conflict resolution, and peace studies, which is really the realm that I like to focus on. So what that entails is mostly looking at conflicts that are going on in the world today. We look at things that are happening locally, so racial injustice in the United States, all the way to global issues that are going on today, like the refugee crisis, and try to analyze and figure out why they're going on, what's going wrong, what creates war, what results from war. Those questions are what we ask. So that's my major. I'm also a minor in anthropology, and so I'm really interested in like looking beyond the narrative, looking at cultures and identities. So I'm really excited to be on this call. I think it's equally about politics. It's equally about interacting with cross-cultural interaction, all of that. So I'm really excited to have that discussion today because it just crosses so many different issues that we're dealing with as a world.
Right. As a dummy like myself, whatever you said just went over my head like that. But I'm just kidding. I get what you're saying, but let me repeat my question. For a layman like myself, so I come from an engineering background, and as you know, most of the desis either become a doctor or an engineer, right? What when you talk about world studies and peace studies? So, for example, in your first semester, all right, for example, right? What are the top one, two, three chapters of any? What are your subjects basically,
Yeah.
and what are your top?
Okay.
Take one subject and tell me what are the top one, two, three chapters that you study as a basic, if you know what I mean.
Okay. So I would say there's like three major things, right? So let's talk number one about mediation, which basically is um, you're looking at negotiation, right? So corporate negotiations, for example, how to deal with a boardroom of people that are disagreeing. And that's a really key fundamental part of what a lot of scholars in conflict resolution do. They just analyze human discussions and try to figure out how to make sure that people don't like bicker when they argue, and actually come to a conclusion, right? So that's the most fundamental element of conflict resolution. The other thing that we're looking at is contemporary issues like terrorism, for example. So what creates terrorism? Looking at like how does someone reach the conclusion that they should, do something that is very violent. That's another very important avenue that people focus on, and they really spend a lot of time with different communities where there's things occurring right now, stuff like that. So those are very different issues, but they interact on this fundamental thing of people are disagreeing, and we just want to help people deal with the disagreements in a way that comes to a positive conclusion that builds something as opposed to breaks something down. And that building something is what we call peace. Peace is very broad in that sense, but it's just building instead of destroying societies, right? And encouraging us to be plural thinkers. So like having disagreements and being okay with disagreements, right? That's the type of thing that we study. I hope that is better at defining.
When you talk about your semester, right? So, for example, if you go out on an on-field internship, so do you go out to places that where real stuff is happening or something like that, or you just do a case study sitting at your desk? And how do you how are your practicals like? If because I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So No, we there's both type of scenarios
Do
going
you
on.
just
So
parachute jump yourself into Israel and Palestine and do something like that? I'm just kidding, but
but we, like, some of our programs, they do, like, we go
Mhm.
down to Israel and Palestine, we sit down and we discuss it. Like, we're not trying to resolve this conflict, it's really broad, but we're trying to figure out what's going on. So we have professors that take students to Israel, Palestine, um uh,
Syria or
or
places like that. Yeah.
Syria, also like Ethiopia and Eritrea, like conflict prone areas, but also areas where there's positive movement. So, like, South Africa, for example, up until recent history, they've been really active with the peace community there. In
Mm,
Africa, there's a lot of positive movement, right? There's
mm.
engineering schools that are doing significant work in certain parts of Africa, East Africa, I think, that are, like, working towards peace, and peace engineering, right? This is a really important field as well. So that's one thing. When it comes to, like, internships and stuff like that, really because we're in DC, we're going to Policy Institute's think tank. So there's a little more, sitting in the chair and looking, like, how they say, like, armchair academics.
Yep.
There's a little of that going on as well, right? So it's a little bit of both. So right now, like, my field work is an internship at a place called Peace Tech Labs, which is part of the United States Institute for Peace kind of ecosystem, if you will. And so a lot of my work right now is like, okay, how do we use peace and technology to accomplish certain tasks? So that's giving me an access to innovative thinking within my field. So a lot of different opportunities for a lot of different students to really see what they want to do with the skills that they're getting in the classroom.
Do you mind if I take a little video while you answer my next question? Just
Yeah,
to,
for sure.
yeah. See, you have all this knowledge and you do all the studies. For example, if I take a student like you, all right, I take a student like you and put you in a place like for example, Kashmir, right? I hope you are at least a little bit aware of what is going on in Kashmir and what the Kashmir conflict was all about, right? What would your contribution be, or what would your job be, or what would you be interested in when you are in a place like that?
Okay, so I think one of the really interesting things about Kashmir for me is, like, the National Council, National Committee that's been present there, the political situation, and really the political disjunction amongst parties that are regional to Kashmir, right? So I think part of the first things that I would do, and people have done this already, right? So I'm kind of going off of what I know, is really try to have a conversation with those that are living on the ground, activists. There's a lot of wonderful artists, and really, so really trying to really focusing on the grassroots, right? Focusing on what people are feeling, right? And I think that would build up to trying to figure out how authorities in that region could be better engaged in whatever conflicts they're engaged in. There's a lot of misrepresentation of Kashmiris. There's a lot of misrepresentation of their struggle, and their activism and their attempt to create their own identity, right? So, like, trying to figure out what's at the foundation of that,
Right.
and really putting police officers and putting political leaders on, that are more national, or more international, in the room with activists and artists, and really having that conversation with them. I think that'd be a really positive first step. Having discussions around identity, around, why are you engaging this issue in a violent way, as opposed to or a systemic unjust way, or a police brutality way, right? Those questions are some things that I would think would be very important to ask. So the first step is just letting, I think for something like this is to really have authentic, real conversations on the ground, and then build relationships between authorities and intelligent individuals, and this brain power that is present within Kashmir, and try to figure out how to move forward from that stage, and hopefully participate, but also have artists and all these activists participate and give ideas, and those ideas should be amplified to a level where they matter. I think those are the essential first steps, right? That I think a person who's peace building is going to need to do to accomplish anything on the ground.
Can you name one or two people that you idolize or admire in your field who are doing the work that you have described so far?
Yeah. So
Can you do you
I
have the potential to become a Kofi Annan, for example,
you
or a
know
Ban Ki-moon, or
I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of inspiring people in the UN for sure. Who've really pushed forward on this. I think that one person who we all idealize because of how rooted this person was is Nelson Mandela, right? Because Nelson Mandela represents an effort for peace, but also an authentic attempt to overcome systemic injustices,
Right.
systemic racism, and make sure that his voice was heard. So it's really this that's kind of the ideal, right? It's
Mm.
balancing the attempt to come to the table and be willing to discuss things with anyone, but then also being able to hold your truth to yourself,
Mm.
and being able to express that truth. Nelson Mandela is definitely one of the people that I completely admire.
Right.
Um, um, and yeah, there's I think art, like writers or like individuals who've really been influential. A lot of anthropologists have been very important to this field. Edward Said, if you know him, Edward Said is this wonderful giant within, I think, anthropology
Hmm.
mostly, but he writes a lot of different literature about how the West misinterprets and misunderstands the East.
Mm.
And his case study was Palestine. He was a Palestinian Christian
Right.
immigrant. So he had a very unique and important role, I think, in shaping my field and the field of anthropology. And so the way that we look at culture today is so influenced by him that I think he's a peace builder. Like he's an inspiration in that way, even though he's not necessarily officially part of the field, right?
Right.
So people who analyze, right? People who really think about these issues are people that I'm inspired by.
People who study the major that you're studying, right? What is their career path? Which way do they go? Do they go work for, say, some Obama's campaigns, or do they go work for UN? Where do they go? Because I don't know, because this is
Yeah,
not really a prevalent field down here in India, right? So,
they go everywhere. So we have teachers coming out of our program. We have psychologists that take the skills and they get a master's in or a PhD in psychology. We have people who go become diplomats, right? Like they become part of the Department of State or the United States USAID, right? So they become part of these really large development institutes, and they go out and they try to analyze issues and stuff like that. So everywhere across that field. We have like divisions within our own school where some of us are focused on collaborative leadership. So we're trying to go into like corporate roles where we're
hmm,
trying to manage like change and things like that within those roles. We have people that are looking at social justice in particular. So they're trying to focus on campaigning for social justice, joining nonprofits locally here. And then we have people that are looking at divided societies. So they're trying to go into the UN, or they're trying to go into different, like there's a common institute here called Search for Common Ground. Um, so they're going to those nonprofits that are global, or like Brookings Institute. And there's a Brookings Institute in India, and Carnegie Endowment is in India as well. So like these institutes are where, like the target for a lot of our students. Um, for me, that's definitely the target, right? Like looking at
right,
think tanks that are global, looking at think tanks that are rooted within different communities. So like in South Asia, in other parts of the world.
right.
Um, but this is a foundational knowledge. I don't think that anyone leaves with their bachelor's complete knowing that they have the knowledge that they need. They really go forth to further their academic knowledge, and then they go into the field if they
Right.
need to.
Right. Dude, how many people do you know from this field from India, basically? Can you name some names that whose work I can go and read or something like that?
Um, so
Right
I
at the top
have
of your mind.
I'm see, this is the thing, like I know people, as in like I read a lot of different wonderful pieces of information that
Hmm.
comes from this region, but a lot of, so I would just say that a lot of the political scientists that are present in India today, um and a lot of the writers who are writing about it from the West that I've read, right, are people who've looked and considered peace building. So a lot, I mean, a lot of the journalists and individuals that I'm reading right now are those that are talking about Modi and all the different, infringements of rights. And I would say that those people are also well aware of just conflict theory in general. But, honestly, it's a really good question, and I should have had that ready. But I definitely have papers and articles that I reference, and I definitely will look into them and hopefully get back to you on that one.
Right. No, no props. What is your path forward? I mean, what are you looking at? Are you going to go and join some presidential campaign or some think tank of some media house like New York Times or Wall Street Journal or something like that? Where do you want to go? Where do you think you seeing yourself? Where do you
The
see
very
yourself?
simple The very simple answer to that is I don't know. So
Okay. Uh,
I'm very okay with the fact that
but you must
my
be having an eye. You must be keen. I mean, you will be delighted if you get into this particular group or this particular mission or something like that.
yeah.
Maybe you want to be on the think tank of something like someone like a New Yorker, or you want to be on the think tank of a UN peacekeeping mission. So where do you see yourself fit, or where are you keen on getting into?
So I would one of the things. There's two things that I'd like to do. Number one, I'd like to be involved in the United States foreign policy system. So Department of State, becoming a diplomat, not just simply because it's a cool role to have, but because in that role, I think that there's a lot that an Indian American Muslim can do to ensure that we understand the issues better, we engage the issues better from the United States perspective. But I also want to go beyond the United States because this is my country, but also I belong to a lot of different places. And so I'd like to have the opportunity to work at a think tank or, I mean, on the ground in India and really understand communities there. I haven't come across a lot of articles or books about sentiments on the ground, feelings on the ground about politics and issues. A lot of the things that I read in India, and you can tell me if it's true, is about how this great politician, how that great person is thinking about XYZ. Well, I don't know if that tells me a lot about what's
Right,
going on the ground, what people are thinking about.
right.
That's really what I'd like to prod. So these are like, for me, it's more about these are the issues areas that I want to focus on in life, as opposed to this is a place that I want to be in or this is a
Mm,
career that I want. I
mm-mm.
think I can get there. I don't know if I can, accomplish this. And I think that's a better goal. Like
Dude,
finding an area that I
one
care about and can address it.
one thing I'll tell you: get into this diplomat role and tell people how fucked up US's foreign policy is, right? Because it is the root of everything that we see in the Middle East today. I mean, people say that Middle East is to blame itself because of peddling all these terrorists all the way from 90s, and now you see the Syrian war and that and this, right? People don't know that US was once upon a time helping Osama bin Laden to fight the Russians in Afghanistan, right? People don't know that. People don't know that US is supplying and helping Saudi to bomb Yemen, which is going through the worst humanitarian crisis that the world has ever seen, right? I think a couple of days back I read an article which said that coronavirus and poverty can literally wipe out the Yemeni population from the face of the earth, right? Now that is
I think the term that has been used is an epidemic of malnutrition before an epidemic
yes,
of the virus, right? Like, so
coupled
these are
with,
very real issues.
yeah,
And
we are
I
lit
agree with you
we
completely.
we are
I
we are
think that,
literally seeing a country being wiped off the map day by as each day passes by, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the case of Yemen, for example, is one where you do see a lot of international oversight, right? Like um, and the lack of that oversight to have an impact. So like I remember like few years back we were talking about just how horrible the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is, and a lot of people, including, I think I agree with this completely, it's not just a humanitarian crisis. The crisis stems from an inability to solve the conflict effectively, and to misunderstand what was legitimately happening in Yemen. The sentiments of leaders, the sentiments of those who were fighting in that conflict, right? So the perceptions of democracy had an impact from early on, right? Like when Yemen was formed, there was assumptions and mischaracterizations of individuals within that nation on the basis of this is what democracy looks like, and this is what it doesn't look like. I also think that yes, the United States is involved, but there's people who are working to change that, and I want to be part of that change, right? Because I think that it's very possible, and I think what it takes is because we know that these are. I mean, we know that there has been involvement of United States institutions, of Western institutions in oppression for a very long time after colonialism, right? And that's just an example. The Yemen example is just one of many
Dude,
examples.
I can take you back to Iran, right? Iran, this British and US governments back then, they installed a puppet ruler called the Shah,
Yeah,
who's basically a puppet, and they made sure that what was the thing? No, there was a prime minister in Iran, a democratically elected prime minister in Iran, who was about to nationalize the entire oil industry of Iran. The U.S. and the Britain didn't like it, so they manufactured a coup. They overthrew him. They bought a puppet Shah, and the puppet Shah was lavish, and he was having his own fun, and the people were out there starving, and it was just this situation of French Revolution, right, in Iran, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it led to Iranian Revolution, and now Iran is stuck with this theocratic state, which is super religious, and it was not really that country. It was a very progressive country back then, right? And whose very few remnants are still there in Iran. I mean, Iranian cinema parallels to none, right? It is as good as any other cinema in the world, but you know how Iran is and how oppressed it is right now in terms of human rights and
Right.
freedoms and
Exactly.
media
I mean,
media freedoms. People blame Iran for that, but how many of them have a clue that it was this United States and United Kingdom's intervention that led it?
well, I think that's you're touching on the key component, and really what that tells me is that there's a lot of very strong rhetoric that comes out of Iran, for example,
Yeah,
and that rhetoric then becomes highlighted within different media articles, different content, and then suddenly we see an enemy, right? When
exactly.
in fact there's suffering, there's legitimate frustration there, and I think it takes good leaders and great international thinkers to really sit there and say, you know what, this is what is being said, but this is what is meant, and let's focus on what's meant. What's meant is that there has been a misunderstanding of and mischaracterization of Iranian identity.
Right.
There's been a use of world authority and world power to assign authority to certain leaders, and let's address that. Let's not if someone was to say that, if someone was to engage it from that level, and if there was a collective force put behind that, I think that would have significant power in trying to overcome the grief and frustration and suffering that is felt by people and countries where the United States and other Western powers have attempted to create false governments under the guise of democracy.
Man, you're talking about Iran, you're talking about the entire Central America, South America, the dictators you see there.
Yeah.
Go on, I'm sorry.
No, but because this goes back and like let's talk about South America for a little bit, because there is such a frustrating and such a sad, grief filled refugee crisis there. There are refugees in Mexico today that, because of COVID-19, the United States and other governments have prevented their movement, right? So let's talk about migration as an example, right? A modern example of just oppressive ideologies. Um, and 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 so like it's unbelievable that these things continue, right? And we can go on and on, but it's
Right,
just there has to be someone and something that changes that. And I
right.
hope that is what this generation, our generation, our global generation, not just like Americans here or Indians there, but like all of us as global people who are seeing this together can have an impact on.
Indians see America as this place of dream, and then the place of a place of uh, a place where you can just go and achieve and be whatever you want. They have this American dream to have a place and a family over there in US. They think that US is a friend, right? You must have seen that Namaste Trump that Modi bought bought Trump to Gujarat, and he did all that, and Modi came over to Texas and he did Howdy Modi
Howdy
and all that,
Modi.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and all that shit. People don't realize back in the day, US hated India. I mean, US was supplying weapons to Pakistan when there was the war, right? Because of this Cold War, India was kind of leaning towards the Soviet bloc, which didn't really impress the US. All right, and I believe US was also trying its level best it with its tooth and nail effort to stop India from getting itself developing a nuclear weapon, if I'm not wrong, back in the 90s. And can you talk about this weird India-US relationship? Because we are not exactly friends, but we have not been enemies as well. It's very foxy in a way, the US relationship with India, the way US treats India, right?
Yeah. Well, so there's so many different routes to this, right? And let's just kind of I think we should explode this issue a little bit.
Right.
Number one, I think the first kind of from the outset, of Indian formation, India had a very positive global role, right? I think there was so many positive grassroots efforts within India, and that led to just a positive perception. And then gradually you see how, as India accrues power, there is this kind of distance that the United States offers. A lot of that, I think, is because the United States is always viewed and characterize certain countries as third world countries, and that's very problematic. And I think India uh, and the non-alignment movement was one of the first most important movements that actually is the birth of many fields, and really question this assumption of, there is superpowers and there is not so great. Like it really erased this hierarchy and this assumption of hierarchy, and I just admire that, number one. And so I
See,
think that's a
you're touching this point, right? So I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll let you continue. But what I'm trying to, back in the day, Eisenhower, the President Eisenhower, was a massive admirer of Nehru, right? And people here in this Modi era believe that Nehru was shit at foreign policy and India was shit at foreign policy. There was this view that India was this weak third world country and India didn't do much. It's only after Modi came to power that India became this amazing
yeah.
superpower where everyone is admiring in the world. Can we just cut that bullshit by what you're going to say now? Go on.
Well, what I'm going to say now is that I think that I don't know if I'm going to, but what I'm going to say now is that the root of what has compelled Trump and Modi to build a strong relationship is not the desire to see a better global system, right? Whereas Nehru's vision, I think I honestly, like, I haven't focused so much on Eisenhower as I have on Nehru.
Right.
And Nehru as an individual, there's a lot there, and there's a lot there that's positive and negative, right? But one thing that I think was very important was just Nehru's vision on a global scale and aligning with African countries, aligning with other countries in Southeast Asia, and saying, you know what, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to become activists on a global scale. And that's, I think that Indians should be very proud of that, that their nation is one that compelled others to reevaluate how we thought of power. And really, there was a racism to international relations. There was a racism to the way that we looked at these issues. And going back to Edward Said, this is something that he talks about a lot. Just the way that we look up until like the 90s, right? The United States and others continue to see other countries in such a demeaning way. So I think that we should recognize the important contribution that the Indian community has had to world relations. And, I think the world community needs to highlight that as well. So this modern kind of interpretation and polarization that has thrived in both India and the United States today is one that has come out of another movement. It's one that comes out of a strategic partnership that is not so strategic. It's one that desires to it's an image, right? It's an image, and I think that no one benefits from that image except for the two people who are at the pulpit of these governments, right?
It's just I was reading one tweet from one of the film critics that I follow on Twitter, and he said it just, I cannot believe we are having a right wing not Nazi orgy at Gujarat with these two populists out there.
No, I mean,
It's just like, yeah, it's like these two power hungry right wing populist men just admiring each other, just helping each other elect. I mean, it's not really a fashion for one leader of a country to endorse the other leader of the country, especially during the election year. But I think we have seen that happen, basically.
Well, I think one thing that's very frustrating is that the fact that this happened in a very important moment in India and in the United States, where these leaders were supposed to be, I think there was a moral imperative that they focus on their country and their people and the suffering that was going on in both countries at that time, for different reasons of their people, right? So the fact that there's this international campaigning going on, right? International election campaigning going on during a time where leadership matters and is important is I think the grossest indecency of this whole. And a reaffirmation of there's no nuanced or authentic attempt to build relations between these countries. It's really just internally trying to bolster each other's political campaigns.
It
So
it
I
it
don't think that we
when
benefit.
Yeah, it's not like an Indian leader and an US leader met on a rally. It was like a Republican leader and a BJP leader met.
Exactly.
It was more like a political meeting than two countries trying to do something substantial over
And
there.
I don't think we've ever really touched on. I don't even know but I asked this question. I mean, what was accomplished? What was accomplished policy wise? What was accomplished migration wise? Right? Like, were there better immigration reforms that came out of this? Were there
Nope.
better
We are still begging for
technology?
H. We are still begging for H1Bs, including me, because I want to come over.
Right.
Right.
Like, I mean, there was not a positive impact on the relation between these countries in a political sense, in a policy sense at all. It was just a photo op, right? And a lot of, and that has continued. That has continued as a trend, especially in the United States.
Right.
That these attempts that could be positive reinforcements of power, not of power, but of leadership, turn into photo ops.
Yeah. It's weird, right? So Modi will not tweet anything that will do damage for the Trump. For example, if they during the time of the hurricane that came down in Houston, I think a couple of years ago. So he was tweeting about condolences and condolences to the victims of the hurricane and so on. But when we see what he has tweeted about George Floyd's protest, nil,
Yeah.
right? I think it's just two right wingers licking each other's boots. That's how I see it.
No. And this is the point where I think I really think that this reminds us that this is more than just a political issue; it's a social issue.
Right, right,
And the fact that Trump did not pay attention to, or the White House in general, right, did not care or did not pay attention to the protests and the voices that were going on, and chose to misrepresent those voices, is indicative of a very social problem and a
yeah,
very gross misunderstanding, again, of just what's going on.
right,
So yeah, it's just, you're right, like it's really just, it's just a stalemate, a stalemate of just reaffirmation.
exactly.
There's nothing that's happening that's going beyond or building anything.
Hmm. So, speaking of George Floyd's protests, right? Um, what was your reaction? When I say your reaction, did it remind you of any instances that you had been through in such situation? Obviously, not such a dangerous and a violent situation, but you, you must have had instances in a country like US. Being a US citizen, you must have had instances where you were reminded of what your skin color was.
I think that, well, I would say, first of all, that I think the African American community has been the most oppressed.
Yes,
And they have been the loudest voice and the most important voice when it comes to minority rights. Like,
right.
I benefit so much from the contribution that they've made. So it's very sad and very frustrating when they are oppressed in the way that they are, and there's police brutality in the way that there is. I would say, however, and there's privilege that I enjoy, right? So
Right.
I live in a suburb, for example.
Hmm.
I live in a community where there is not such again, like, misunderstanding or stigmatization or stereotypical behavior assumptions about minorities and individuals
You're
in
basically
general.
saying there are no Trump voters in an area. I'm just kidding.
I mean, right, but also what I'm saying is that I don't
By the way,
experience.
folks, I don't mean all Trump voters are racist, but go on.
Well, yeah, and I've had some great conversations, right, with a lot of people on both sides of that in our community. So there's a
Hmm.
very important, I think, understanding, which is that I'm privileged to live in the place that I do,
Right.
and I'm also privileged in the sense that oftentimes I haven't experienced the level of just oppression and wrongdoing by the police that others have.
Hmm.
And so I'm sure that, I mean, there are personal experiences that I've had that are less than perfect, right?
Right.
And and that reminds me that, yes, there is oppression and there's wrongdoing, and the police is not justified in everything that it does. Absolutely
Right.
not.
Right.
But I don't think I was not surprised when I read. I was very surprised and I was very disturbed, and it affected me deeply when I watched these videos of George Floyd and Ahmed Arbery and all these other people who were just brutally killed. And it was wrong, and it was surprising, right? It was very surprising. And it should not have been, right? In retrospect, it should not have been, because there's so much of that that has occurred. But
There's so much of that that is not being captured, but it's still happening.
exactly. And not just in the United States, elsewhere as well, right? Like there's governments and police forces that misunderstand and misrepresent and misact. And so I think it helps me reevaluate where
Mm,
my priorities are. And I was at the outset, I was very disturbed, and I completely, a lot of my friends were able to go to the protest. I was not personally able to go to the protest,
right.
but a lot of my friends were, and they just saw that as very important. I saw it as very important that they went, and I saw it very important in that moment, and a lot of us did, to support organizations, to support people, to make sure that people, we did some campaigns at campus where we raised funds for supplies, face masks for protesters, stuff like that, to ensure that we're supporting and we're helping out as much as we can, because it's very important. And uh, I think that, like, we as and I think Indian Americans in particular, because that's what the community I'm part of, I think we have to do more to support our minority brothers and sisters. We have to do more to support the migration rights of, the community that's coming from Central America and South America. We have to do more to support African American rights. And that's a responsibility that we have, because we benefit from the work that they do. So I think that we can do a lot more,
Right.
especially in the community that we are. But we're very privileged in this country,
Mm,
so we can definitely do a lot more.
right. The reason why I ask is because this protest, I felt, yeah, there have been instances of police brutality in the past, and there are many other names that I see float around Twitter, which have not got any justice. But this was something different, right? This was like some sort of a tipping point, right? I mean, this incident is making senators kneel. This incident is making corporations reevaluate their PR strategies to reflect that they are changing, and it is having some effect on every level, all the way from corporations to politicians to individual households, right? What can you tell about this particular movement's effect on, for example, let's start with corporations.
Yeah. So I'm asking my question like every week. This question of, like, what is it about this particular issue that has caused such a great tipping point? And I think a lot of people are asking that question, and I hope that we'll come to some great answers.
Right. Can I give my answers before you go ahead? I'm so sorry to
Yeah, go
interrupt.
ahead.
My answer is people are locked up. It's a pandemic. They're locked up. Most of them are on the edge of losing their jobs. Most of them are living their life on the edge in general, and they see this happen, and it's just too much to take, and they have nothing to do. I mean, they will go out. That was quite obvious. But sorry, go on.
I mean, I think that that's definitely something that a lot of people have said, and it's something that I think we should look more deeper into. But there's so many. The one issue that I have, to be honest with you, is that I think what's happening is that people are taking these analysis points and they're misconstruing them. So they're saying, oh, like, this is not such a big issue. It doesn't really matter. It's just people are really just riled up, and it's mob mentality. They're just doing this because. So I'm just resistant to the assumption that there's any one reason that this has
Mm,
occurred. I think that it's important to focus on what people are saying and why they're saying it,
right.
and what I'm hearing. And so corporations wise, I would say that a lot of corporations have at the outset were very much doing what they usually do, which is make a social media post about it, make a press release about it, and just move on to the next thing. We recently saw with Juneteenth, which was yesterday, that some corporations moved to change some branding. They removed some very problematic messages um, from their product lines. Other organizations are doing more to support their funding. They're raising funds. They're donating from their own foundations and stuff like that. So there's positive movement in at least in the structure that we have set up, right? In a capitalistic realm, there's positive movement when it comes to corporations. And I think those positive movements were not there from the outset, and people spoke out about it. They said, you know what, a black tile is not enough. Like, that was the first most important thing. I think people really said a black tile is not enough,
Hmm.
and you can't clog up our social media and just make this statement. You have to do a lot more. So I think that really what's happened is what you've seen corporations do and change is because people have stuck to this. They've really taken
They're just
this.
calling every single corporation left and right on the social media, right? This social media mob, and they're bringing
Well, it's
these
not just social media. I think that there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes and a lot of activists and lawyers
right, right,
that are also active and ensuring that their friends in those corporations and those people in those corporations are also being held accountable. And we
mm,
also have to recognize that a lot of these corporations, they're humans that work there. And
right,
so though I think there's a lot of different boards and leaders that are getting pressure from the internal.
mm,
Just I think a few days ago, or I think yesterday, there was a resignation in the Department of State, and a legislative one of the undersecretaries of legislation, right? So like a sub minister resigned, and the reason they resigned was because it was just too much for them to not see any action regarding George Floyd. So there's pressure on the inside as well,
right.
and that is having a positive effect.
Do you think there will be some laws that will come in to change the way policing is done and change the way the police are trained, for example? Because I read that they're not adequately trained, to use force and how much force is appropriate. They're not really trained to judge that properly, and the criteria and the bar is so low to become a policeman in US in few states that that is being touted as one of the reasons of why incidents like these occur.
Right.
And do you think any change happening on terms of policing laws or something like that?
I think so. I don't know. So I already know that there's great legislation that's occurring to create databases between police departments in the country, so to ensure that we're aware of who has, like, there was we don't want. I think a lot of different legislations are recognizing that we want to have a stronger national role in trying to understand what's going on the community level. And
Hmm.
so there's an attempt to kind of make sure that we're aware of what's happening in police stations, and those police stations are connected across the country, so that those that are infringing on the rights of others are not missed and they can't move on to another police department, right? So that's
Right.
a very fundamental and important thing that I think should have happened 2 decades ago,
Yeah.
but it's happening. um, I know that there's other legislation happening on the state level, in Virginia, to ensure that police officers receive less funding that goes towards military.
Militarization. Yeah. Right.
Um, just yesterday though, I saw a tweet, and then I was talking to my friends, and some police station bought United States Marines, like one of those very large trucks. So there's still this happening. It's not like it's going away, but there's people that are talking about it now. Because I remember like 2 or 3 years ago, I was at a law conference, and that was the first time that I heard about the first time that we were talking about stop and frisk, and there was a very strong connection made between how this was a form of oppression, that this was a form of wrongdoing that was misconstrued as a form of successful policing, right?
Mm.
That was a conversation happening in a law school. Now it's happening in the entire community. So
Right.
I think there is that attention being paid, and those reforms are starting to be made in a positive. But communities are really progressing at their own pace, right? So some
Right.
communities move forward. Other communities like mine, there's a lot of exposure that the police officers and their departments are getting now, because we didn't really focus on these. My community, for example, as a community that was problematic, but then there are problematic issues, and those are being worked. We're reworking those as a community and trying to find better reforms for them. So it's a haze, right? It's a haze of different legislation and different efforts, but I think that it is amounting to something, and amounting to a lot more than it might have if there was not such a strong movement behind it.
Right. You're talking about something positive happening on the grounds of reforming the policing laws and stuff like that, but no one is really getting deeper down to the problem of the actual inequality that is leading to situations like these, right? There is literally no conversation about how to bring this equality down. I mean, you are living under Trump regime, who's giving tax breaks after tax breaks for the rich, and literally peanuts for the people who are not so fortunate to fall in that tax breaking bracket.
I I think that that sentiment is true, But one of the things that's been very powerful for me is, so when I came into college, there was this discussion around Confederacy, right? That was happening of Confederate statues. So
Yeah.
during the Civil War, after the Civil War, there was a bunch of statues put up of different Confederate heroes, right? When I went to high school, we still talked about these people as heroes, right? Um, I live in a part of the United States that is, I would say like 50%
Yeah,
south.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which
Because
city do you live in? What, Richmond?
I live in
DC?
Fairfax County, which is, I would say, 20 miles from DC, right?
Okay. So
So
back
not
in the
too
day,
far.
in the Civil War days, where did your county fall? If you had it, if you
Um,
had to guess,
so yeah, so actually, our county fell. So Richmond was the capital. So
of
like,
the Confederacy.
no, it was actually, so half of it was Confederacy, half of it was part of DC's part of the Union. So like we were
Right.
like fringe Union, I would say.
Okay.
But there are these paintings, and you can still find these of battles occurring in like there's trails. So there's battles that occurred in like 10 miles from here, 5 miles from here,
Hmm.
and there's still trails that occur. Like people go on those trails and they see like this is where the Civil War occurred, etc. There's also paintings. So one of the things that there was this dynamic of the elite within the Civil War, and so there was a battle happening in a place called Leesburg, which is about I think 20 miles from here, and Northern Virginians right back then were a privileged class because they were from DC. There's a privileged political class. They had a picnic, so they were like watching as a battle occurred, essentially. Talking. This is not relevant to what we're talking about right now, but there's a disparity to this to this
Right.
conflict,
Right.
and
Right.
there's people benefited from just observing it.
I
But
I heard one instance where back in South in the Confederacy that if there was a guy who's from a rich family that owned more than 10, 20 slaves, he didn't have to enlist in the battle, enlist in the army.
I wasn't aware of that. But I mean, I don't. I'm not surprised by
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah. There was this movie, Matthew McConaughey movie, where he's stuck in this civil war, and he's like, this is a poor guy's battle. We are fighting a rich man's war. The poor man is fighting for the rich man. So that I think he said something on those lines. But when I talk about inequality, of course there is inequality in the South and among the redneck states. No offense, but I'm really talking about the inequality within the African American community itself, right? The decades of segregation and the Civil War.
Yeah.
There are still places down there in U.S., especially in South. I'm not sure how much in Virginia, but uh,
No, no, everywhere, right? Like the
yeah,
North and South. You're right. No, you're completely right. And I thank you for bringing that up because I think it's important to talk
yeah,
about that.
right.
I would just like to end and say,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Before you proceed, I just want to ask: is any conversation happening to bring those communities to the speed, to the space that the rest of the country is going on? So, can you talk about that? Sorry, go on.
well, I know that I kind of went on a tangent, but my point about the Confederacy issue and the statues was that this was an issue that was debated, like morally debated, like it was a moral debate.
Damn.
But only now do we see people saying, no, 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 this is wrong completely, and we need to ensure that we're not having these statues up, or that this is completely wrong. There was this discussion in the same way that discussion is happening. There's been this continuous discussion of what role does legislation and politics have in ensuring that that the nation and its citizens are equal and equitable.
Right.
And I think that equity and that equality is something that we're talking a lot more about right now. I don't think that it's amounted to legitimate policy changes at this point,
Right.
but I think that people are reconsidering and reanalyzing their own privilege, and they're also recognizing the ghettoization, and the fact that these communities have not gotten funding. They've been oppressed. The policies that we see that are police brutal within these countries, within these cities. Sorry, which actually it seems like a completely different reality when you see it. So it can be like visiting another country because it's
Right.
just. So I would say that a lot of this is not a conversation that has evolved to the level that other conversations have. in this stage. But I think that
Right.
there is an active movement towards trying to understand and
Hmm.
reevaluate our own history and reevaluate the way that we're learning about these things, and
Right.
thinking about these things to the level where we see systemic oppression, and systemic injustice as something that is not just the police, right?
This is exactly why I liked Bernie Sanders, right? Because he did his best and he was shouting his lungs out to bring this particular issue into the conversation, into the conversation of the people, right? This inequality, this accumulation of power and wealth in the hands of very few individuals, and how that is literally killing, not only killing the livelihoods of the people, but it's also killing the opportunity that the other middle class Americans have to innovate and to get up the ladder. It is getting, the middle class is diminishing. It is getting harder and harder to climb up the ladder to reach the next class or level of whatever we are in right
Right.
now, right? The gap is just going on and expanding on and on and
Absolutely.
on. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that that was something that I think Bernie Sanders. One thing that I think we all appreciated as young people, a lot of young people appreciated this, was that he was consistent in fighting for that. And like there was, the 99% and the 1%, that type of thing,
Yeah.
became very prevalent in the United States. That analysis became very popular in the United States. But even before that, Bernie was talking about economic disparity. And now, yeah, you're right. I mean, the wealthy across the world, the wealthy continue to increase in their wealth, 10, 20 fold. And there's just a disproportionate amount of poverty and injustice that occurs as a result. And so I think that, that has definitely fed into this discussion.
Right.
Of course, I think that there's a sensitivity in talking about social class and social structure, and then racism, especially in the United States. I think it's very challenging to talk about both of them at the same time sometimes.
Hmm.
Um,
But man, they are so interconnected. I just
they're deeply interconnected,
right,
deeply interconnected.
right. How did you feel when Bernie lose?
A lot of okay, so I think that there was so much positivity brought forth by that movement, and an energy in a sense of these things can be changed, these things can be transformed. And I grew up in 2000, 2006, 2008 really molded my understanding of politics. And so
Right.
Obama, obviously, as an orator, as someone who spoke the language of hope,
Right.
didn't inspire us. So we were looking for an inspiring leader,
Yeah.
and we were looking for an inspiring voice. And Bernie did offer that in many ways.
Right.
So it was frustrating to see a systemic problem, a problem of politics, a
Hmm.
problem of internal politics as opposed to politics that we can engage, take him over, right?
Right.
Um, and connecting this to our current movement, a lot of people have recognized that it's not just Republicans that are responsible for the systemic injustices faced by African Americans. It's also Democrats.
Yes.
Um,
The
it's also
neoliberal centrist good guy Democrats.
right, and also like these policies that police brutality and all these different things. They're also legislations that are approved by a lot of Democrats, right? Like it requires their involvement as well. So
Dude,
I think
I'll tell you an example, right? We can we are totally right when we question what did Obama do exactly for the African American community. I mean, he had the Senate in his hand when he was the president. Man, he could have revolutionized and passed so many laws. He had that power in his hand. Uh, There was not much difference when Obama was the president for the African American community.
and yeah, I think that, and again, like that goes back to just the establishment as a part of our analysis, right? Like who is the establishment, and what is the establishment doing, right? So I think you're completely right. I mean, as a leader of charisma, and uniting people, Obama had a very important role.
Yeah,
But when it came to policy changes, there was some disconnect
right.
for sure.
Dude, Obama was the same guy who was adding more troops in Afghanistan and droning the crap out of Pakistan's tribal areas while he was receiving a Nobel Prize, right? So I'm really skeptical about democratic foreign policy uh, directions. For example,
Yeah.
Hillary
Um,
Clinton is basically a warmonger, if I'm not wrong.
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of different politicians who have come to the elections, the Democratic elections, have pushed a narrative of we're going to solve systemic injustice, we're going to
Yeah,
address all these wrongdoing and all these issues, and then people have been okay. Wait, like what have you really done for foreign policy? Because it's also a component.
right.
Um,
What do you
and
think of Joe Biden's foreign policy? Because all I see in the campaign of Joe Biden is that I'm not Trump, vote for me. But I want to dig deep and see what his foreign policy is all about. Will he be any different from the previous U.S. administrations towards India
so
and towards the refugee crisis that's happening in the world in general?
yeah, I number one, it's not. I don't see this as something that is being talked about a lot right now. Like in the sense that when it comes to uh, the rally, and actually Joe Biden has been good about not having too many rallies or not having too many public. Actually, he hasn't had a press release, press briefing in 77 days is what I think it is at right now. So like, there's been a lot of political silence in a mourning at least. So there's been some
Hmm.
very correct culture, right? And I use that word very specifically because it's not necessarily solidarity, but it is like a distance for the sake of not being attacked,
Playing
essentially.
it safe.
Playing it safe, exactly. Yeah. So to your question, when it comes to Biden's foreign policy, I think he is looking more for a reversal and a return to the Obama era, right? And that's been a lot of his policies. But also, I'm hesitant to say that he has a coherent foreign policy vision because the people involved in his campaign change, and a lot of them are forward thinking in the
Right.
sense that there's a lot more representation in his campaign
Hmm.
now. There's a lot more minorities, Muslims, Indians, and a lot of other communities as well. African Americans are represented, not to the level that I think we should be expected. We should
That's
there should
that's the bare. He's doing the bare minimum.
doing the bare minimum, but and yeah, it's very bare minimum, but it may result in some more authentic and honest conversation about these are the injustices the United States has committed. This
Right.
is the role that it has in perpetuating humanitarian
Hmm.
crises in Yemen,
Hmm.
in other countries as well.
Yeah.
And as individuals, we have a responsibility to deal with this. So I think that type of rhetoric and discussion is something that's happening internally. Um, and there's a lot of different people that I know that are involved with that. So I know that I would have preferred. I know that Bernie's foreign policy was very different, right?
Right.
I think he really went after the Nelson Mandela model in the sense that he was honest about the issues that he was concerned about, and he
Right.
brought attention to a lot of very fundamentally wrong things about United States foreign policy and the
Right.
involvement of foreign countries in the United States legislation,
Hmm.
right? I don't know if we're going to see that, but I think we're going to see more authentic conversations that it's going to result in better policies that are not going to be warmongering, that are not going to be
Hmm.
so interested in using military to
Right.
solve conflict.
Right. Dude, one more thing you asked me to bring up in this conversation is that you somehow, I think you said you work on the refugee crisis as well as a part of your master's or bachelor's. Can you talk about that a bit? What do you do exactly, and why did you want to bring this up?
So I want to talk about, I think the one conflict that I've been very interested in and had the opportunity to talk to people about is the Rohingya refugee crisis.
Hmm.
Because it is, I think it's one that, in the American realm, it's a very large crisis. It's not one that is always prominently featured, but I don't know like what opinions in South Asia look like to a South Asian refugee crisis, right? Because it
Right.
is a South Asian refugee crisis. So I
I'll
want
tell you in one line what India thinks about Rohingya crisis. Rohingyas should be kicked out because that was the most obvious response you could expect from a right-wing government. But it's not really a positive outlook here. We are not really keen to help them in a way. We just want to stay. We just want to make sure they stay in Bangladesh. Just don't come over to India.
so
But
the
I'm sorry.
one
Go on.
I mean, another question to you, because I've been talking so much. I think that this should be a conversation as well.
Right.
Sorry about it. But what do you? So I've heard this analysis that because of India's involvement with South Asian countries and its alliances, it cannot say too much. Do you think that's what's limiting as a factor, or is it just the just disregard of human life?
Um, I'm no political expert in any sense. All right. All I see is a party that's trying to keep its power. And one of the ways it will try to keep its power is to make sure their voters don't get angry. The core voter base doesn't get angry. All right. For example, when I see a person like Trump saying Mexicans are rapists and Muslims should be banned, all right, I don't care if he means that or not. What I care is he is really riling up his voter base, and he is exactly saying what his core voter base wants to hear. All right. And what the Indian government's core voter base wants to hear is we are not allowing infiltrators in our country. All right. That is the basic message the government wants to give. So,
Okay.
obviously, to keep its power and to keep its voters sane, it is quite obvious that it is sad, but it is obvious that it is not going to show any concern for the Rohingya crisis, which is terrible, right? People are getting brutalized in that country, Myanmar. Basically, Rohingyas are just see Myanmar is this country where it is basically a racist issue, right? So there are these Myanmar people who look Asian, and there's this Rohingyas who look like more South Asian, which
Right.
look like you and me, right? So there's obviously this oppression of this majority Asian-looking people on the Muslim South Asian looking people, right? And it is quite evident. See, obviously, it is a military dictatorship, and the leader of Myanmar, I forgot her name, but she was
Uncle.
yeah, she was touted as this peace activist.
Right.
I believe she was given a Nobel Prize, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
She was right because she secured some sort of democracy in the Rohingya.
Right.
Basically, she made a deal with the military, and the military kept wanted to keep the things that it would do generally, and they gave her part of the bargain, and one part of the bargain was keep the Rohingyas out, and you can see the most peaceful Nobel Prize winner not saying a thing about Rohingya crisis, right?
Yeah.
So when the own leader of the country is not saying a thing, I mean, it's too much to expect other countries to talk about them, and least of all, a right-wing government like India's.
Right. Well, that's I think that's an important. What you said, I think, is very important. Because like the complacency, I don't think history is going to look positively upon that, at all. Um.
Hopefully,
So.
it is written by the right people. But
Right.
if Nazis has had won the World War II, we would be reading all the evil stuff that Winston Churchill had
Yeah.
done, right? Because
I.
Winston Churchill, we hail him as a hero, right? But Winston Churchill was basically a racist who diverted a majority of food supply from Bangladesh to his army fighting in the Europe, and he said these Indians, they breed like rabbits, and I don't care if they die hungry. I wonder if Gandhi had died. That's exactly what he said.
Right.
And
No,
today,
I mean there is hypocrisy,
oh
and
yeah,
talk about systemic injustice. There's definitely xenophobia that was present in Europe, not just in Germany at that time. So I think you're completely right.
why
I do.
why do you think they are down there in the UK because of all these George Floyd related protests that are happening? Why do you think they are boxing every single Churchill statue? And did you see that happen? They are literally putting all these statues in a boxes, all those the statues of all those people who basically made some sort of profit through slavery, or who had made racist comments,
Right.
and it was so blatant when I saw that, and I'm like, dude, you're basically protecting racist statues, and you're literally telling people who are the racists and who are not.
Well, I think this asks the question, like, what? It's not just about our legacy, right? It's about what
Yeah,
legacy do we really want to have. Um, and we've so throughout history, like you just said with the Winston Churchill example, we've been amplifying, and insisting on creating positive. We've been revising history to the benefit, of what we think is going to represent good and bad, right? So it's a good story.
exactly.
Um,
History
I
is
think
written by the winners.
right. So, like, one of the questions I have is like, can we move beyond that point now? Like, is there a possibility of that? Because because it's really important that we represent and ensure that the citizens of every country, and global individuals around the world, have the opportunity to see that they are equally part of a country, or equally part of the story, right?
we,
So
we we should have this culture of looking at history in an objective way, not just through the lens of one particular group or one particular
exactly, yeah,
alliance. So you look at World War II history, we look from the view of allies alone, as in when I say allies, the allies of France, UK, and US. Not to downgrade the wrongs that Nazis have done. They were terrible, right? But dude, just because you are the winners doesn't mean we are gonna just gloss over your
exactly,
faults, right?
yeah,
Like for example, um, we all study that Hitler had killed and had killed 6 million Jews and exterminated almost half. I
right,
don't know what percentage. There's some major chunk of percentage of Jewish population in Europe, right? How many know that
percent,
King King Leopold from Belgium
right,
had killed so many Congolese? He used to literally cut the hands of kids who didn't pick enough sugar on that day in front of the parents,
wow,
right? So
yeah,
that is what we are talking about
right.
when we are talking about hypocrisy, right? You and I never knew about this. I just read about King Leopold just like a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not sure how you if you know about it until I told it to you. And
I don't know about that particular fact,
yeah,
but
he killed enormous amounts of Congolese people when Belgium was colonizing Congo, right? But we only read the parts of history that the winners have written, right?
exactly, yeah. And the one thing that I've appreciated now is just, not only is it history, it's also literature, right? Like literature does amplify and help create representation,
Right.
because this is not just an issue of the facts, right? The facts are very important, and we need to ensure that the right facts are there. It's also an issue of affirmation representation, that we ensure that people and their histories are respected as well,
Right.
right? So if I'm growing up in the United States, and I have for a very long time, I was only able to read American history, or the
Hmm.
American history that I was taught, which was a very sterile version of it.
Right.
And I was not able to learn a lot about my South Asian background, or the policy of Nehru, Bhagat Singh, all these individuals that are very important, right? Ambedkar, like I did not know about these people, but if I knew about them at the time that I did, it would have only supplemented my ability to contribute in
Exactly.
this country and elsewhere as well.
Yeah. We need some big event, like every time. It only takes some tragic big event to divert the conversation towards these issues. For example, George Floyd happened and it diverted the conversation towards racism, and people are coming out even in fields like cricket and sport, and they're talking about what happened, their experiences with racism in their particular field. And like for example, you remember that little boy who died on a beach, which really ignited this conversation about
Right.
Syrian crisis. Yeah, I don't know what will it take to divert the mind of the world towards Rohingya crisis or Yemen's crisis.
Right.
I don't know, man. I don't know how we're gonna bring awareness.
Well, I think that my response to this is to say that there's always going to be, and it's very important to have public opinion.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be these movements that occur at the base of public opinion. But I think it's important for us as individuals to orient our careers and our professions towards the assistance, not just the assistance, but the authentic engagement of these issues, right? Like we can, if there was a larger class of students that were focused on these issues, right? And they were given the opportunity, because it's not just them, it's the structures around them. If they were given that opportunity, I think we would have a more sustainable way of addressing these issues, and people that are paying a lot more attention to them.
Right.
So I think that we should, whatever happens next, there should be a movement towards that. And there have
Right.
been movements,
Right.
because you don't always have to be in the sphere of public influence to be able to make a difference. And for a lot of these crises, um, a lot of things happen behind the scenes. There's a lot of problems with the way that refugee agencies deal with
Mm.
these camps. For the Rohingya community, there was this very large advocacy movement around education, that They should be given a proper education to ensure that they can advocate for their own rights, or that they should be able to participate in the decisions that are made about their camps, right?
Right.
Because they've literally, like a lot of these Rohingya refugees, they've built these camps. They came and then they built the camps themselves because they didn't have the resources,
Right.
and they weren't resources. They weren't given many resources anyway.
Right.
So they have a right to that, is what, so that type of advocacy and that type of attention that is consistent is very important, I think. And it
Right.
won't always be at the center of public opinion, but it has to be at the center of some people's minds um,
Man,
throughout.
forget about Rohingya and Yemen's crisis, and there are literally people from Mexico who are being caged, and the kids are being caged in your own country, and I wonder what
No, I
percentage of
think you're right. I think we
population.
should talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I wonder what percentage of people actually know about that, about what's happening, with people being separated from the families, the kids in cages.
Right. No, I mean, like we said, just right now, there's refugees coming from Colombia, and they've been stopped at the border, and
Exactly.
they're being kept in refugee camps, and they're not given proper sanitary tools. These are refugees. They're
Yeah.
fleeing from conflict, and this is how we're treating them, right?
Right. Right.
Right. So you're right. I think American policymakers have to think about that as well. And we saw the cages, and we saw the effect of that type of very horrible immigration policy
Right.
in the United States. And someone has to come and say, that was just not the Trump administration. That was also other administrations that did that, and we need to change that as well.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so you're right. I mean, it's everywhere. It's especially true in the United States that there's these hypocrisies that occur, and we need to find a way that's not a mass movement.
Mm.
Constantly address it.
Right. Right. Man, I mean, you talk of all the difficulties that refugees go through and add pandemic to it, add the COVID-19 issue to it.
Yeah.
I mean, one breakout, one spot, one case in one camp, and there are thousands there. I wonder what is being done about that.
Well, I mean, the one thing that I've learned is that in a lot of these refugee camps, not only is that an issue, the other issue is that employment has gone away. Um, and a lot of the support that refugees got has gone away, right? So a lot of different agencies, the UNHCR, others are
Mm,
pleading countries
right.
to give, and the United States has pledged so much, but they're, in some cases they've given 20% of that, in other cases they've given 50% of that. So even those countries that were known to somewhat, even a little bit support, are not supporting as much as they used to.
Right.
So you're right. It's a very frustrating crisis.
Right.
And not only is it about, okay, what happens when COVID-19 gets there or whatnot, but it's also about, like, what precautions could we take right now, and what kind of rights do we owe people that are refugees,
Right.
right? To ensure that they have that. And there's a lot of wealth that these nations have,
Yep.
especially the United States. I think we need to hold ourselves accountable for that.
Let's
Not
just
even
let's
1%
also
of
say that
that.
it's a stolen wealth, but yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's oppression that has led to that accruement.
Yeah.
But even then, like, there's less than 1% of our federal budget that's dedicated towards international aid.
Right.
Um,
Right.
is it really going to hurt us that much if we up that a little bit?
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and if we spend a little more time trying to ensure and hold these institutions accountable, I don't think that it is. So I hope that those things change. And also, like, a lot of these refugees are in already poor countries,
Right.
and proportionally these countries are the ones that are supporting them. And
Right.
so what kind of support are we offering them?
Right.
I think that's one of the biggest kind of issues that the Bangladeshi government has had, is that you expect us to be held accountable, but then where's the support?
Yeah.
Because we want these refugees to thrive in our environment, but where's the support?
Right.
So I think you're right. You touched on a very important point about whose wealth is it, and then who does it really belong to?
Exactly. Dude, you just a while ago you were talking about Nehru and Ambedkar, and so you, as an Indian American, basically an American who grew up in American schools, studied American history, what do you know about them? What is your view on how Nehruvian policies affected India post-independence? What do you know about Ambedkar? What do you know about the other good leaders that you think were good and did something good for the India? Can you touch base upon that, if
So
you can?
I said this before and I say this again. One of the things that I've talked a lot about Nehru and I admired him during our podcast. One of the things that I think is frustrating about Nehru is the management of Kashmir and the management of other international conflicts. I think there's a little bit of frustration that I have there in the sense that I think there could have been better decisions made. I'm not here to judge, right? But I think that certain things were made because of political maneuvering and things like that. So Nehru is one of many, but I think Ambedkar is someone that I really admire because he is someone who, the Constitution of India and the contributions he made to it are very advanced. And advanced in the sense that the policies that he made were very thoughtful and they were forward thinking. And so that's one thing I appreciate Ambedkar as a legislator and as a policy mind. He was someone who really never gave up on a vision of trying to empower, trying to ensure that there was equality. And I think America could learn a lot from that, and American policy could change by studying the Ambedkar case study. So Ambedkar is someone who's I definitely look up to. I think pre-independence leaders like I really enjoy poetry, and I've been trying to get more into like just the very unique artistic expression that was present in South Asia. So like Muhammad Iqbal is someone who I've particularly been interested in as an individual who's attempted to create identity and talk about identity in a very unique way, having come to the West and then looking at the West and appreciating the West, but also trying to understand what problems we have with analyzing the East. So those type of things I've really appreciated. And so there's so many different individuals. But these are very recent things for me. Like I've only started to read a lot of the literature that's coming out of India and a lot of really unique work that's being done by different historians and stuff like that.
Do you see any parallels between Ambedkar and Bernie Sanders in a way? Because Bernie advocated for free healthcare, free education. I think if Ambedkar was alive and he was around, maybe if imagine if, for the sake of the argument, if he was an American, right? I think he would have gone on the same path that Bernie had gone with free healthcare, free education, ensuring minimum dignity for each and every single citizen of his country, right? That's the
Yeah.
premise of his all his policies, if
Right.
not most.
I mean, no, absolutely. I mean, I go back. You know how like Ambedkar had this very famous blue suit. Um, uh, so I'm thinking about that as just a symbol of kind of one of the most important colors of like Bernie's campaign was blue,
Yeah,
and a lightish blue. So it's a very anecdotal. I get it, but I would say that Ambedkar, and I think Ambedkar would see a lot of the reforms that Bernie was making as positive movements, and I think he would also contribute. Like he would also talk a little bit about the need to represent minorities better. Like he would see areas of improvement within Bernie's campaign as well, because I think that's the sort of person that Ambedkar was. That he analyzed things from a very independent mind. And so I can imagine that there would be a lot of connection that both leaders would have.
right,
I think that there'd be a lot of support that both leaders would lend themselves in a critical way. Also, I think one thing that's really important is that Ambedkar was in New York, and so I can imagine that he interacted with people who had similar leanings to Bernie. But
right,
both leaders, I think it's very important to note this, is that when we look at social policies or socialism, even these people navigated that in a very different age. Bernie and Ambedkar,
right,
and they were able to show us how there is reforms that we can make in our existing systems that can get us to a point where they can be more social.
right,
And I think it's very important to remind ourselves of is that this is not that the policies that they were advocating for were not a departure from any sort of idea of our nations. It was just a betterment of those ideas and a further movement and a positive movement towards a better state for both of these countries.
right. Dude, you and I can talk about ours on everything else that we have not yet covered, but do you realize that we have been talking for 2 hours?
Have we?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But man, here's the thing. I think this is not the last time I'll talk to you. I believe we'll connect again. I have a very strong feeling that there's a lot to be spoken about. Probably, especially, I will get hold of you during the US election for sure. Also, I'll get hold of you in between as well. I think there's almost like 3-4 months gap between the US election and now.
There's some
But
time, yeah.
dude, it's fascinating to talk to you and listen to your thoughts. And I think you will become a good, at least you will become a good political pundit if you fail at everything else. But I don't wish that. I wish you all the luck, all the best in whatever you're trying to do and wherever you're trying to reach. And man, keep doing your work. And I really shout out to Samula for connecting us. Man, it's been great fun talking to you.
Well, I really enjoyed this, and I hope that we can connect again. And I hope next time I can get more of, I can talk less and hear more from you. That's really my goal next
Dude,
time.
I have a very dumb mind, so you'd rather not say that. But
I don't think so, but
but man, it's been great fun talking to you. Thanks for joining, and tell people if we can find you somewhere on LinkedIn or on anywhere else on the social media.
yeah. So I'm actually most active on LinkedIn, and you can find me by my name, Omer Yousuf, and I'll also send you my URL to that, so you can find me there. But yeah, I'd love to connect with you all professionally, and I'm really interested in the conversations that you're having as from wherever you are, because I think it's important to have a diverse field of thoughts to then engage. So I hope to see you all or talk to you all at some point.
I think that's a fantastic note to end this podcast, bro. It's been great fun. It's been great fun talking, and thanks to folks who have been listening for this long. That's it from Sollu Kaburz podcast. Bye, everyone.